Okay, thank you for joining. So today we've come to our 5th lecture, and in today's session we're going to understand the user um, input properties on HTML5. So in today's session we're going to cover a lot of concepts. So we'll look into learning outcome 5, then we'll look into learning outcome 6, which is introduction to um, document object model, and then we'll look into the final, and we'll now also look into introducing JavaScript and its use. So we'll understand the purpose of JavaScript and why do we need this when it comes to web designing. Okay, let's just go back. Let's just go back to Learning Outcome 5. So our indicative content for Learning Outcome 5, we will look into text field, checkbox, radio button, image, video embedded with CSS, props, and so on. So this key terminology, we have already introduced them in our past tutorial, and we've looked at a really nice video. Now what we're going to look at is we're going to understand and implement HTML input field with example. So what could be this input field? When it comes to input field, we just referring to all those functionality with HTML that allows us to interact with the user. So with the input field, we now have the ability to activate our keyboard and allow our user to enter certain values. For example, if our user is trying to subscribe to our page, to a newsletter, or whatever, they can now use this input field and they can now enter the email, full name, email, and phone number, for example. So how do we initiate this input field? We now use labels. So we now have our opening tag, and we now have to label it, and then we now declare an input. So we now know that name, which is what goes between our bracket, has to be a input type, and you allow us to enter text while if it was another different type of input type, we'll, for example, use numbers or special character or so on. So we now define how input are used, and input are very important because we do find them when it comes to using passwords or secret information. So this input field is very used and very common when it comes to JavaScript. So when it comes to HTML input, and we always use an ID. So we'll now create this field where we know that he has a specific purpose and he has his own ID. Also, we can, as I said earlier, we can have different various type of input. We just need to give them the name. So for example, here we have password, email, or maybe a value also. So when it comes to numbers, we have to use a date input. For example, here with the date input type, we now let the user select a date from a date picker. So they can now choose a specific date, which will now shown as numbers. We have also radio button, which allows users to select one option from a set. So we'll now have, for example, the ability to choose like the gender, and we now have to use a radio button to choose one only option. We also have checkbox, where this will now allow users to select one or more options from a set. So we'll now create maybe a multiple choice where our user can now choose maybe different type of activities or hobbies that they like. So instead of only one, they can choose multiple. Drop down list, we all know how they work. We now have, we can use the same example of checkbox, but by
This
just,
all goes into the HTML, yes?
yes, we can
We are
all
trying to
use
make a type of form.
tags. Yes, we will now
Yeah.
use our label tags to label them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So drop down pretty much have the same concept where we click on it and we'll now have one only option instead of multiple. Text area is a bit different where where simply allows us to, we will now allow it is now used for multiple text input. So for instance, where we need to like write a message, say for instance, we're trying to subscribe and at the bottom we have a big area where they want us to add further information, further details, we can now write a text message in there. Submit button, we all know, is a simple button which will now give us a input where we're now going to store the data that we've now collected from our user. So this is a very pretty simple input type, and you now create a form for us. And this has to be responsive because he has to now interact with our backend. This was everything for LO5. Is there any question, or we can move to LO6?
Yeah, we can go to 6 now.
Okay. So now we'll have an introduction to document object model and its basic concept. So what can we define about document object model? So this is a programming interface. So we'll look at this as an interface for our web document. You now represent the page so that the program can change document structure and more and so on. So this interface allows us to communicate and have the ability to change within the time. So as we can see, we have an example of a simple HTML document. And what we can see is that we declared at the beginning that this is a document type of HTML. So we define what type of document is at the beginning. So what the DOM for this document will now represent each element as a node in a tree. So we now know that this document type is HTML. We now have a header, body, and a footer at the bottom. When it comes to implementing the DOM management, we now have to typically interact with the JavaScript. So this is very useful because we now can change our text by using this function, calling this function, which is very common in JavaScript, where we now have our document and we now try to add or delete or retrieve information. So as we can see from the example here, we're trying to add an event listener. So we're just trying to add a value into it. Also, the script can now create a paragraph. It now allows us to add this document inside the body. So when this document is clicked, the text content of our first header within the header will now change. So we do have an example of how this is done. So if, for instance, if we now have this add event listener and we click on it, it will now prompt a new message for us. So you now display a new message that we've declared in our JavaScript.
So DOM is connected to JavaScript.
Yeah, you see here in this example where it says
Change text
document.
content.
Yes. Yeah. So we just
That's all
if you have
JavaScript.
yeah this is an interface. So DOM document object model is an interface. So it's connecting our HTML to our JavaScript. So it's an interface. He's a middleman. He's in the middle. But yeah, he's both. I'd say it's both of them because we have a text we want it to change. So by clicking on it, we now have this new value, this new property.
I'm just a bit puzzled. I don't quite understand this at all. Is there a visual way of showing it to me? Like a video explaining this DOM management?
Okay, let me just type in here. Okay, HTML DOM. The HTML DOM is structured of a tree object. So we have our root element. Then is basically JavaScript, which can change HTML element within that page. So as we said, we have a text. We can click on it, and you now change the concept of it. So there's not much of a example of it because it's more like a structure. So this image is pretty much going to explain because it's a document object model. It's a model, so it's a kind of like an architecture. So these are the various things we can do with the DOM. So we can change HTML element in a page.
So is this meant to be
Can change
this DOM
attributes.
is located into the HTML file?
Yes, is in the HTML file, but it's a JavaScript concept. Is an architecture. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay, here it says when a web page is loaded, the browser creates a document object model on the page. So whenever we load a new page, we now load in a HTML DOM. And is an architecture. Everything on your web page, the first is an interface. So you see your web page, but what happened behind the scenes is that we're now working with the DOM. So on your web page, you see the user interface, and behind the scenes, there's our architecture, our DOM, and this is the structure of it. This is how everything is structured.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not tangible. It's not like we can run an example. It's a concept behind
So it's not something that you even
web page.
type into the HTML file. Is this meant to be a visual flowchart?
Yes, basically
So it's
that's what
not.
it is.
So
It's a model. Is a model. So it's not something you can run as a function.
so it's not something you type down. It's not.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just
You would have had another name, maybe document object function or object
okay.
method. It's not a method. It's not something you're calling in. So it's a model. So it's an architecture. Okay, where's my presentation? Okay.
Then if that's the
This
case,
so
what
this is
what
the
are you
example.
typing down here in this change text content if it's meant to be a flowchart?
This is what you type. This is command that you're going to type for him to change the text content. Because you see here, 1 second, let me go back. So this is what we can do. We can change element, we can change attributes, we can change CSS style within the DOM. And this is the example of how this has to be declared. So we can get element, we can add, we can retrieve, we can delete. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so we have an example here. When the button is clicked, the text content of HTML1 element with the ID of the header will now change. So by clicking on it, we'll now have a different output, and what we want to output is the DOM has been changed. So here we have an example of adding new element, removing. So it's pretty much following the CRUD statement, which is create, retrieve, update, delete, and we can now work with them. Okay, so we have example of modifying style. So we can, as I said, we can modify by adding these commands, and we have an existing one, and this will now change. So as we can see here, DOM is a manipulation. DOM manipulation is a powerful feature that will now allow us to dynamically change content, structure, and style of our web page within them without needing to reload the page. So it's a really powerful way for us to add in and modify our web page. So is there any question related this DOM within related document object model?
No.
Okay, so we can now move into JavaScript. Okay, so what do we know about JavaScript? So we all know JavaScript is a programming language, and it is classified as it is versatile, which means it is reusable in a different environment, and it is a high-level programming language. So what do I mean by high-level programming language is that JavaScript do not the difference between low level and high level is that with the low level we now have to use an interpreter. No, so not an interpreter. We need to have what do you call it? Not a constructor. I'm missing the word for it right now at the moment. What I'm trying to say is that JavaScript uses an interpreter, while a low-level language like Java or C++ will now need I'm missing the word for it. What was the name again? I'm not quite sure. I can't really remember the name, but once I come up with it, I'll let you know. So the difference between them is that when we work with Java, or C++, the computer only understands binary numbers, so it only understands code of 1 and 0. So we need something that is going to convert English language into binary numbers. So by doing this conversion, our machine will now understand what we're trying to input, what we're trying to tell them to do. And you now return this to us in the English language with our output. JavaScript, instead, on the other side, is a high-level programming language. So you use an interpreter. So he understands what we're trying to do, because by you giving an input, the JavaScript will now try to guess what you're trying to do, and you now return a similar value. I think the word for the other one was constructor. I'm not too sure. No. Once I remember, I'll just explain in more detail. Okay, so here we have capabilities of JavaScript. So we have DOM manipulation. So with JavaScript, we can access and change all the elements of our HTML document. Event handling. So with JavaScript, we can now respond to the user interaction. So for instance, when we have like clicks, form submission, or so on, it is used also for animation and graphics. We'll now create 3D animation and so on. We will now use various JavaScript libraries, which will now allow us to create these animations. Also, we have asynchronous programming, where we're going to handle operation like fetching data from our server or doing other functionalities. So JavaScript, as we know, we could either create our document file and save it with a .js extension. So if we're creating like a mobile app, we could create our JavaScript file, we create it as app.js, or we could easily add an inline script. So what do we mean? We want like how we have our CSS, which can be added into our HTML page. We can do the same with our JavaScript. So we're now going to create a script. As you can see here, we have our opening and closing tag for our script, and we're now going to use our DOM. So we want this to add the content to load. So this is how we're going to do it. And in order for us to display this on our browser, or to display on our terminal, we now need to have our console log, which will now give us our output. External JavaScript is what I explained, is that we're just going to create our file externally, and we'll now save it with our .js extension. And underneath, we have an example of how this has to be created. So if we put in our .js file into our folder, we just need to fetch the name of it and add it with the opening and closing tags. Also, we can now manipulate in CSS within our JavaScript. What can we do? So we can now dynamically change the style of our HTML content, and this is also achieved by altering the style property on our DOM element. And here we have the example of how this has to be done. So we can also interact with other type of HTML element. So any section that we have within our HTML file, we can interact with them through with our external file. We can now code this inside our HTML document. So as we did the example of having a submit button. This submit button can be modified inside our external JavaScript file, and will now affect our HTML file. So this is a simple example of integrating JavaScript. So as we can see from here, we have a script which has been added in the middle of our body. And what do we want this to do? We want him to change the text bottom. By just clicking on it, we have this function which will now change the initial text, and you now display a new text with a new color as well. So what we'll cover in our next tutorial, we'll look into more concept of JavaScript. So we'll look into variables. How do we work with variables? So there are different type of variables that can be used to store data within JavaScript. So we can use var, let, or constant. So let is the most common used function, the most used variable when it comes to declaring numbers. And const will now be used when we have fixed values that we are not going to change. Also, in the next tutorial, we'll look into operators and so on. So we'll have an example where we go through all these JavaScript concepts. And this is everything for today's session. Is there any question regarding JavaScript?
Yes, in terms of the JavaScript,
Yes.
I understand that you can make an external JavaScript so that way you can connect the two with the HTML and the JavaScript. But when you're
Yes.
trying to make it inline, it seems to me that you need to make it more simplistic rather than this rows and rows of details that make it feel as if it's going to be like a change in animation and things like that.
Yeah.
What would be an example of an inline JavaScript exactly in terms of what it would change?
This is this one here. You see here where we explained here we have a document. So this, and then well, let's see if I can get a visual example from here. There should be an example somewhere. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so here we have our document, opening and closing tags. So we have body. So we have our paragraph. Instead of adding hello JavaScript into our HTML paragraph, we now create a script. We add our document get element by ID, and we call this ID as demo. And what this has to display is this hello JavaScript. You remember how we did the example with paragraph? We just had to add the value here within the bracket. Instead
Yeah.
of doing this, we have an inline JavaScript here.
Yeah, but what's the purpose of that rather than just typing it down anyway?
It very much depends on how you program. So I would say it's best for you to do everything in your in your JS file. But this is just an example of how maybe you're working in a software company and they need to make some changes. So I don't know if you ever heard of agile methodology. I think is one of the units that we will cover in this course. So when you work in a team of developers, they follow agile methodology where projects are delivered within time frame, and there are different type of approach to agile. One could be Scrum, and with Scrum, you now may be required to make changes to your document straight away. So maybe instead of going through a long paragraph, a long JS documentation to make a change, they will just go directly into the HTML and add this script, for instance. So this could be an example. So it very depends on how, what change you're required to do and the reason why you're required to do this change. So some developers might find this inline script useful for them to add maybe some visual text, some text or some documentation. So this is is something additional which you can use. So depending on how you're working in a project, you might need this script, this inline script, or maybe most of the time they don't need it.
Okay.
So it's something additional. It depends. Maybe you have a priority task. Your manager say you have to run, make this change, make this, make that, and you quickly add the script into this without going to break the entire code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Is there any other question?
No, not at the moment. I think no.
Okay, so if this is everything for today, I'll just end the session and see you on Wednesday. So they've made some changes to the session. I don't know if you received the link. So we'll learn next tutorial is on Wednesday instead of Monday.
Okay.
So it'll be the final one where we go through all these JavaScript functionality with examples. And then the following day, we have our assignment discussion.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joshua, for joining, and I will see you next week.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.